It was a cloudy and rainy afternoon in Denver. Drops of rain ran down the windows of the Cafe Central, where customers sought shelter from the storm unfolding outside. The place was welcoming, with soft lights and a peaceful atmosphere that provided a perfect escape from the bad weather. Sarah Miller, a 27-year-old woman, was sitting at a table near the window. Her wavy brown hair fell over her shoulders, and her green eyes absently observed the street. She was waiting for a friend, but the friend had an unforeseen event and canceled. Alone, Sarah decided to take advantage of the time to relax and maybe even start a new book. It was then that he entered. Thomas Blackwell, a 32-year-old man with a commanding presence. He was wearing an elegant dark coat and a tie that seemed a little out of place on a rainy day. Her hair was perfectly done, and her blue eyes shone with an intensity that caught your attention. Thomas looked around the cafe, and his eyes met Sarah's. Without hesitation, he walked towards her, a confident smile on his lips. "May I sit here?" he asked, his tone soft and inviting. Sarah, a little surprised, hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I guess I don't have much of a choice since I'm not expecting anyone right now," she replied, trying to sound casual. Thomas settled into the chair in front of Sarah and began a conversation that flowed naturally. He talked about his interests, his work, and his adventures, and he quickly made Sarah feel comfortable. The conversation between them was easy and fun. Thomas had a way of making Sarah feel special, like she was the only person who mattered in the cafe at that moment. He shared intriguing stories about his travels and experiences, and Sarah couldn't help but be drawn to his captivating personality. As they spoke, the atmosphere around them seemed to disappear. The conversation was lively, and the connection between them was palpable. Sarah was delighted with the way Thomas made her feel, and he seemed genuinely interested in getting to know more about her. It was as if fate had conspired for them to meet on that rainy afternoon. As the meeting dragged on, Thomas began to reveal a more personal side. He talked about how he had found success in life, but also about his insecurities and fears. His vulnerability was touching, and Sarah felt a growing empathy for him. When the cafe started to close, Thomas proposed that they continue the conversation elsewhere, a restaurant he knew not far away. Sarah hesitated for a moment, but Thomas's irresistible charm and curiosity about him convinced her to accept. At the restaurant, the night progressed with more conversation, laughter, and a growing sense of connection. Thomas did everything he could to please Sarah, praising her intelligence and beauty, and sharing his own dreams and ambitions. Sarah was delighted, but at the same time, a little voice in her head warned her about how quickly things were moving forward. When the night ended, Thomas offered to walk her home. Sarah cautiously accepted the gentle gesture, but the feeling that she was entering something deep and unknown could not be ignored. They said goodbye with a soft kiss on the cheek, and Sarah entered the house with a mix of excitement and nervousness. What Sarah didn't know that night was that her charming and promising encounter with Thomas Blackwell was just beginning to reveal a darker, more possessive side. That kiss on the cheek would be just the beginning of a relationship that, despite seeming perfect at first, would quickly turn into a nightmare. The possessive psychopathic lover's control was about to manifest, and Sarah was about to enter a cycle of manipulation and control that would ruin her life. The relationship between Sarah Miller and Thomas Blackwell seemed to have started off promisingly. After that magical meeting in September, the two began to meet frequently. In the beginning, Thomas was the ideal partner, attentive, caring, and charming. Sarah, dazzled by the new romance, was completely in love and looked forward to every moment she spent with him. However, as the months passed, Thomas's behavior began to change. What initially seemed like loving care turned into something darker and more unsettling. The first indication that something was wrong came when Thomas began to show jealousy over Sarah's friendships. He would make subtle comments about her friends, implying that she spent too much time with them. In a particularly unsettling moment, Thomas confronted Sarah about a friend she had casually mentioned. He accused her of being interested in another man and insisted she was hiding things from him. Sarah tried to dismiss the accusations with rational explanations, but Thomas's growing distrust began to undermine her confidence. It wasn't long before Thomas began monitoring Sarah's every move. He installed tracking apps on her phone without her knowledge and made sure he knew where she was at all times. When Sarah left for a work meeting, Thomas followed her and approached her at the office door, claiming to be concerned for her well-being. Sarah was frightened by the fact that Thomas had so blatantly invaded her privacy, but he managed to convince her that he was just worried about her. Sarah's attempts to set limits were ignored or turned into arguments. Thomas used his manipulation skills to make her feel guilty for wanting space. He became more controlling every day, even visiting Sarah's apartment without warning and, in some cases, even making a point of knowing what she was doing at every moment of the day. Sarah began to feel more and more isolated. Her friends and family noticed the change in her behavior. She was more anxious and often avoided socializing. When they tried to talk about Thomas, she clammed up and changed the subject. The psychological pressure and control from Thomas was beginning to take a toll on his mental and emotional health. On one particularly disturbing night, Thomas demanded to know Sarah's email password, stating that he needed to ensure there were no secrets between them. Sarah felt pressured to hand over the password, fearing an even more violent reaction if she didn't. This act of submission was a turning point. Thomas had crossed a line, and his control was becoming even more absolute. Sarah tried several times to end the relationship, but Thomas always found a way to manipulate her into returning. He used emotional blackmail tactics, saying he couldn't live without her and would devastate her if she left him. Sarah felt trapped in a toxic relationship where her attempts to escape were thwarted by Thomas's manipulation and control. Thomas's behavior began to become more aggressive and possessive. He began to invade personal spaces and make increasingly unrealistic demands. The threats became more explicit, and Sarah's fear began to come true. Thomas was determined to keep her under his thumb, and his obsession was leading down a dangerous and unpredictable path. Sarah's isolation continued to grow, and she found herself increasingly alone in the fight against Thomas's possessiveness. She tried to convince herself that things could get better, but Thomas's behavior was becoming increasingly threatening and oppressive. The relationship, which had begun so charmingly, was now plunged into a spiral of control and manipulation that seemed to have no end. The tension between Sarah Miller and Thomas Blackwell had reached a critical point. Thomas's possessiveness and control showed no signs of abating, and Sarah was living under constant pressure. The feeling of being trapped in an abusive relationship became unbearable, and Sarah decided to seek help. She made an appointment with a therapist and began to open up about the situation. Sarah was desperate to find a way out, but the fear of how Thomas would react to her actions kept her on constant alert. Thomas, on the other hand, was increasingly paranoid and aggressive. He began to suspect that Sarah was hiding something from him and became furious whenever she mentioned going out for appointments that didn't involve him. On a cold, foggy January night, the situation took a dramatic turn. Sarah had decided that she needed to break up with Thomas for good. She felt trapped and knew that the only way to ensure her safety was to break away from him completely. She prepared herself to face the difficult task of confronting him and ending the relationship, hoping it would be the last time she would see Thomas. When Sarah arrived home that night, she found Thomas already waiting for her. He stood at the door of his apartment with a dark and determined expression. Thomas was visibly angry and, upon realizing Sarah's determination to end the relationship, his behavior became more threatening. He entered the apartment without permission, something he had done several times, but now seemed much scarier. Sarah tried to remain calm and explained, once again, that the relationship needed to end. She expressed her desire to break up and asked Thomas to leave her house. Thomas heard her words, but his gaze became colder and more threatening. He was obsessed with the idea that Sarah was trying to leave him and was unwilling to accept that reality. Thomas started screaming, accusing Sarah of cheating and wanting to ruin him. The situation quickly escalated into a physical confrontation. Thomas advanced on Sarah, and she tried to defend herself, but fear and surprise paralyzed her. In a fit of rage, Thomas brutally attacked her. The confrontation turned violent, and Sarah, in desperate desperation, tried to resist, but was unable to stop Thomas's attack. During the attack, Thomas appeared to be completely out of control. He continued to attack her, and Sarah only managed to call for help before passing out. Thomas, in a state of rage, attempted to cover up his crime by manipulating the scene to look like a suicide. He made it look like Sarah had committed suicide, throwing her belongings around the apartment and scattering evidence that could be misconstrued. When police arrived at Sarah's apartment the next day, following an anonymous call alerting them to the crime scene, they found the gruesome scene that Thomas had prepared. At first, it seemed like a clear case of suicide, but the presence of struggle marks and Thomas's behavior raised suspicions. The investigation soon began to focus on Thomas. The truth about what really happened that night slowly began to emerge. Evidence found in the apartment and information gathered by investigators led to Thomas's arrest. Thomas's aggressive and possessive behavior, which had been recorded by Sarah's friends and family, helped build a solid case against him. Sarah Miller was found dead in her apartment, and the tragedy shocked the Denver community. Thomas's obsessive control had ended in a brutal crime, and Sarah's life was tragically cut short by someone who was willing to do anything to keep her under his thumb. The investigation and trial brought to light the truth about the abusive relationship and violence that culminated in that fateful night. After the tragic murder of Sarah Miller, Denver was in shock. The city, known for its tranquility, was now marked by a brutal crime that shook the community. Thomas Blackwell, the possessive lover who had become a murderer, was now the center of attention from authorities and the media. When police began investigating the crime scene, the case initially seemed simple. The scene was manipulated to look like a suicide, with Sarah's personal items scattered strategically to create that impression. However, the detection of signs of a struggle and marks of aggression led investigators to consider other possibilities. The disconnect between the crime scene and what Sarah's friends and family knew about Sarah and Thomas's relationship raised additional suspicions. Thomas Blackwell was called to give evidence about the night Sarah was found. His version of events was full of inconsistencies. He claimed that he had gone to Sarah's apartment to try to talk about the relationship, but found the scene chaotic and immediately called the police. His attempt to divert attention and manipulate the narrative did not convince investigators, who began to piece together the puzzle. Police did an in-depth search into Thomas's life. It turned out that he had done a lot of research into covering up crimes and had a history of obsessive and controlling behavior. Witnesses who knew the couple began to provide information about the dynamics of the relationship. Accounts from friends and family revealed Thomas's pattern of abusive and manipulative behavior. Thomas Blackwell's arrest was accompanied by a series of media reports detailing his disturbing behavior and the circumstances of the crime. The city was paying attention to the case, and the Denver community was eager for justice for Sarah. Thomas Blackwell's trial began in February 2023. The prosecution presented a solid case, detailing Thomas's obsessive and controlling behavior and how it culminated in Sarah's murder. Prosecutors presented evidence that Thomas had planned and carried out the crime with deliberate intent to keep Sarah under his control, even if it meant killing her. During the trial, witnesses were called to report the impact of Thomas's behavior on their lives and on Sarah. Sarah's friends and family described the suffering she had faced due to the abusive relationship. Evidence of Thomas's manipulative and aggressive behavior was widely discussed, revealing a pattern of behavior that led to crime. Thomas Blackwell tried to defend himself by claiming that what happened that night was an accident, but the defense was unable to present a convincing narrative. The evidence and testimony were overwhelming, and the image of Thomas as a possessive psychopath was clear to the jury and the public. The verdict was announced at the end of February. Thomas Blackwell was convicted of first-degree murder. The sentence was life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The judge appealed to the public and authorities about the importance of recognizing and intervening in abusive relationships before they become fatal. The case of Sarah Miller and Thomas Blackwell brought a sense of closure to the Denver community, although the pain of Sarah's loss remained. The tragedy served as a warning about the dangers of abusive relationships and extreme possessiveness, highlighting the need for support and resources for those facing similar situations. The story of Sarah and Thomas was marked as a dark example of how obsessive control can lead to tragic results. Sarah's memory and the fight for justice for her was a painful reminder of the devastating impact that abuse and obsession can have on people's lives.